It's okay, I'm here. I'm scared, Emily. Don't let go.
Greetings, gentle viewers. I trust this day finds you in good health and high spirits. The wind off the Wyoming high plains does not ask for permission. It simply arrives, dry, sharp, and carrying with it the particular smell of a place that has been making quiet promises it never intends to keep. Judith Cleaver arrived in Copper Creek on a Thursday afternoon in October of 1884, stepping off the Union Pacific line with a weathered leather trunk, a legal certificate folded 4 times inside her coat pocket, and the kind of stillness in her eyes that only comes from having already survived the worst thing a person expects to survive. She had crossed half a continent to marry a man she had never seen in person, only known through letters, careful, measured letters, written in a hand that told her he was educated, deliberate, and lonely in a way that matched her own. His name was Robert Helt, a homesteader, a man who had built something from nothing out here on the frontier and needed a partner with the legal mind to help him hold on to it. The telegram that found her in Kansas City 3 days prior had told her Robert Helt was dead. Fever, it said, sudden. 2 weeks gone by the time the wire reached her. She had sat in the depot in Kansas City for 4 hours with the telegram in her hands. Then she had folded it, placed it in her coat pocket beside the marriage certificate, and boarded the westbound train anyway. There was nothing left to go back to. The East held nothing for her but empty rooms and memories she had already exhausted. What she had not expected, what no telegram could have prepared her for, was what she would find waiting on the platform of Copper Creek when she arrived. She smelled it before she saw it. The crowd. A press of bodies gathered tight around the town's central square, the kind of gathering that held its breath, the way a crowd only does when something ugly is being given an official name. And there, raised on a flat wooden platform that had clearly been used for livestock auctions, stood 3 girls. 3 small girls in dresses that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone thin as paper. The eldest, perhaps 12, with dark braids and eyes that had gone deliberately blank, the way a person goes blank when they are trying not to feel what is happening to them, stood straight, with her arms around the younger 2, whose faces were open and terrified in the way that children's faces are before they learn to close them. A man in a coat that carried the careful weight of deliberate authority stood at the edge of the platform with his arms folded, watching the crowd with the smooth, practiced composure of someone who had done something like this before and found it entirely manageable. Judith set down her trunk. She had not planned to say a word until she had found somewhere to sleep and eaten something that was not railroad food. She had planned to be quiet and careful and to think before she acted. Then the youngest girl made a small, desperate sound. Not quite a cry, more like the sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to cry. And Judith Cleaver raised her hand, stepped into the square, and said in a voice that carried across the whole of it, "Stop this right now." The entire town turned to look at her, and that was how it began. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Did Judith's courage in that moment stir something in you? Because here is what we know. One person, willing to step forward when everyone else steps back, can change the direction of an entire room. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We would love to say hello to you personally. Hello, and thank you for being here. If this story has already found its way into your heart, please take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment. We are building something wonderful here together, and every single subscriber brings us closer to our milestone of 1,000. You are not just a viewer, you are part of this community. Thank you for being here. Now, let us go back to Copper Creek. The town of Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory, had been incorporated in 1879 under a land charter that promised mineral rights, timber access, and free passage along what the charter called the Sagebrush Corridor, a natural valley pass that cut through the ridgelines and reduced a cattle drive's time by weeks. By 1884, the mineral rights had produced nothing worth extracting. The timber rights, however, had become something else entirely, something worth protecting, stealing, and killing over, though no one in Copper Creek said that last part out loud. Judith did not know any of this yet. What she knew, standing in that square, was that the man in the expensive coat, who introduced himself, with visible irritation at having been interrupted, as Mayor Jonathan Grimmer, was attempting to auction off 3 orphan children to satisfy what he called a defaulted estate debt owed by the late Robert Helt. "The most humane resolution," Grimmer said, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of a man who has rehearsed his explanations carefully, "sits on land encumbered by a tax statute from 1880. Robert Helt died without a surviving adult guardian of record. The council has determined the most humane resolution," Judith said, "is not an auction." Grimmer looked at her the way a man looks at weather he did not predict. "And you are?" She reached into her coat and produced the folded marriage certificate. "Judith Cleaver, contracted bride of the late Robert Helt, which gives me a legal standing in this estate that supersedes a municipal tax claim, Mayor, and I suspect you know that." She did not know that for certain. She had spent enough years working as a legal secretary in Philadelphia to know the broad shape of frontier land law, but she was working from memory and urgency, and the look on the eldest girl's face, which had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from blank endurance to something that might have been a fragment of hope. The crowd was very still. Grimmer looked at the certificate. Then he looked at Judith. Then he looked at the certificate again, with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had believed to be controlled. "This is highly irregular," he said. "So is selling children," Judith said pleasantly. "Shall we take this to your land office and review the statutes properly? Or shall we continue doing it in front of the whole town?" Someone in the crowd made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough. Grimmer straightened his coat. "The matter is adjourned for review," he said, as though adjournment had been his idea. He turned, and his 2 hired men, broad, quiet men in dark coats, stepped back with the particular obedience of men paid to do exactly what they are told and nothing more. The girls did not move. Judith walked up the 2 steps to the platform. Up close, the eldest was 12, with the eyes of someone older, and a jaw set at an angle that said she had been preparing herself for whatever came next, and was only now recalibrating. "My name is Judith Cleaver," Judith said quietly. "I was going to marry your father." The girl held her gaze for a long moment. Then she said, just as quietly, "He was a good man." "I believe that," Judith said. "What is your name?" "Mary," the girl said. "Mary Helt. These are my sisters, Clara and Ruth." The 2 younger girls, Clara perhaps 8, Ruth perhaps 6, were looking at Judith with the wide-open attention of children who have learned not to trust quickly, but cannot help wanting to. Judith nodded once. Then she picked up her trunk herself, because no one else had moved to help her, and said, "Then you had better show me the homestead." Mary Helt looked at her for exactly 3 seconds longer. Then the girl turned, took her sisters by the hand, and led the way off the platform. It was not trust. Not yet. It was something more provisional, a shared direction, and the provisional decision to walk in it together. It was enough to begin with. The Helt homestead sat at the end of a rutted track, 3 miles east of Copper Creek proper. Tucked against the base of a ridge, the locals called the Sagebrush Wall, a long, curved formation of pale stone and juniper that blocked the north wind and made the small valley below it feel, on a still day, like a cupped hand. The cabin itself had been built with genuine care. Judith could see that immediately. The logs were fitted well, the roof was sound, and someone, Robert Helt, she presumed, had laid a kitchen garden alongside the south wall that still showed the dry stalks of a late summer harvest. He had been here. He had been building something. What he had not had time to build was a proper understanding of what Grimmer wanted with his land. The first night, Judith slept on a rope bed in the cabin's single bedroom, while the three girls shared a pallet in the main room. She lay awake listening to the wind off the ridge and organizing what she knew. Robert Helt had died. His estate was being claimed under a tax statute. 3 children were being prepared for dispersal. A mayor with expensive tailoring had an interest in the speed of that process. What she did not know, the actual wording of the 1880 statute, the real value of the land, why Grimmer wanted it specifically. In the morning she found Mary Helt already awake, standing at the kitchen window with a tin cup of water, watching the ridgeline in the pale gray light, with an expression of careful, habitual watchfulness. "You have been keeping this place running," Judith said. It was not a question. Mary did not turn around. "Papa got sick in August. I have been managing since then." "How old are you, Mary?" 12. Judith absorbed that. 12. Running a homestead, managing 2 younger sisters, watching a father die, and then standing on an auction platform with her jaw set and her arms around her sisters like a wall. "I am going to need to understand this property," Judith said. "The land, the boundaries, any documents your father kept. Will you help me with that?" Mary turned then. She looked at Judith, the way the girl had looked at her on the platform, with that careful, assessing steadiness. "Papa kept everything in the kitchen," she said at last, "under the floorboard by the stove. He said never to let anyone know about it, unless it was someone who could be trusted with it." The pause that followed was a decision being made. "I do not know yet if you can be trusted," Mary said, "but I know what Grimmer is, so I suppose you are currently the better option." Judith almost smiled. "That is a fair assessment." The floorboard produced a tin box. Inside the box were 3 things: a land deed dated 1879 in Robert Helt's name, a hand-drawn map of the property boundaries that extended significantly further east than anything on the county survey, and a letter, sealed, addressed in a careful hand to someone named Dr. Harold Hank of Copper Creek. Judith looked at the sealed letter for a long time. Then she looked at Mary. "Did your father know Dr. Hank?" Something shifted in Mary's expression. "Dr. Hank was the one who wrote to you," she said quietly. "Papa did not know about it, but I think Dr. Hank was afraid of what Grimmer was going to do, and he needed someone who could help. And I think he knew Papa was going to die before Papa did." The silence that followed this asked a person to reconsider every assumption they arrived with. Judith set the sealed letter down carefully on the kitchen table. "Then I had better go and speak with Dr. Hank." Dr. Harold Hank's office occupied a narrow building on the west end of Copper Creek's main street, wedged between a feed supply and a closed dry goods store, whose owner had left town abruptly 6 months prior, after a dispute over water access. The doctor was perhaps 60, with spectacles that had been repaired twice with wire, a coat that had been very good once and was now simply clean and worn, with the dignity of a man who understood the difference between vanity and self-respect. He had kind eyes and the particular posture of someone who has spent decades carrying things that are not his to carry, but carries them anyway, because no one else will. He opened the door before she knocked, which told her he had been watching for her. "Miss Cleaver," he said, "I am very glad you came. I was not certain the letter would find you in time." "It found me in Kansas City," she said. "Robert was already dead when it reached me." He looked away briefly. "I know. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for all of it. Please come in." The office was small and precisely organized, the kind of order that belongs to a person whose mind is orderly, but whose circumstances have been complicated. On the desk, beneath a paperweight made of a smooth river stone, sat an iron-bound ledger. He placed it in front of her, without preamble. "I have been the physician in Copper Creek for 19 years, he said. "In that time, I have also kept records, not just medical ones. When I began to see a pattern in who was getting sick and when, and what happened to their properties afterward, I started keeping a second set of records." Judith opened the ledger. It was meticulous. Date, name, nature of illness, Property address. What statute Grimmer had cited within 60 days of the death. Outcome. 11 families over 4 years. 11 homesteads that had passed, legally, on paper, into the hands of a timber concern called the Ridgeline Clearing Company, whose legal filings were handled by an attorney whose office was directly adjacent to the mayor's. The 1880 statute, she said, reading. An act for the settlement of frontier tax delinquencies. It applies to estates over a certain acreage whose owners die without a surviving adult guardian. Grimmer helped write it, Dr. Hank said quietly. He was on the Territorial Council in '79. He put in the language himself. Judith read that sentence again. Then a third time. He built the trap before he started setting it, she said. Yes. And the Ridgeline Clearing Company. What does it want with homesteads on this ridge specifically? Dr. Hank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the careful weight of a person sharing something they have held alone for a long time. There is a pass, he said, through the sagebrush wall. Robert Helt's property sits directly across it. The pass cuts through the territory in a way that would reduce a cattle drive's time by weeks and a timber route by even more. The company that controls that land controls access to the most valuable natural corridor in 3 counties. Robert's eastern boundary, the one on the hand-drawn map, not the county survey, encompasses the mouth of that pass entirely. Judith set down the ledger very slowly. She thought about Mary Helt, 12 years old, standing on an auction platform. She thought about 11 families. She thought about a mayor who had written a law and then spent 4 years using it. Dr. Hank, she said, I am going to need this ledger, and I am going to need to know everyone in this town who is still here and still angry. The old doctor took a long breath. For a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been afraid for a long time and was now being asked to be something other than afraid. There is a man named Donald Bell, he said at last. Grimmer's foreman. I do not think he is entirely what he appears to be. I think he has been protecting the Helt children in ways that Grimmer is not aware of. But he has not been willing to step forward. Not until now, Judith said. The doctor looked at her. Then, very slowly, he nodded. Judith spent 3 days in Dr. Hank's office, working through the ledger and cross-referencing it against the county deed registry, which the doctor had quietly obtained copies of over the preceding 2 years. She worked at the pace of someone who had spent years in a law office, learning how wrongdoing hides itself in the space between what paperwork says and what paperwork omits. Here is what the 1880 statute actually said, in the section Grimmer had written: an estate of 40 acres or more, held by a sole adult proprietor, who dies without a living adult spouse or legal guardian of surviving minor children, may be assessed for outstanding tax obligations, and if those obligations exceed the assessed value of portable property, the land itself may be entered into public resolution. Public resolution, not auction. Public resolution, which under territorial law required 30 days of public posting, a formal hearing before a full council quorum, and, critically, the right of any individual with a documented legal claim to the estate to appear and contest it. Grimmer had been skipping the hearing. He had been posting the notices in a legal register that almost no one in Copper Creek read, and then proceeding to resolution within a week, before anyone with standing had time to appear. It was not invisible wrongdoing. It was wrongdoing conducted in the confident assumption that no one with enough knowledge would bother to look. He counted on isolation, Judith said to Mary one afternoon, who had taken to sitting in the corner of Dr. Hank's office with Clara and Ruth, listening with that particular 12-year-old quality of processing everything and displaying nothing. He knew that most frontier homesteaders do not have access to a legal secretary who has read territorial statutes. And now he has one, Mary said. It was not a question. It was something closer to satisfaction. Judith allowed herself a small smile. And now he has one. What Judith had not anticipated was the visit she received on the evening of her 3rd day, when someone knocked at the door of the homestead after dark. A single, deliberate knock, not the double knock of someone announcing themselves, but the single knock of someone not wishing to be heard by anyone other than the person inside. She opened the door with the oil lamp in one hand and found a man she recognized from the edge of the crowd on the day of the auction. He was large in the weathered, structural way of someone who has spent years in physical labor. He wore a dark coat with a foreman's badge pinned to it that he had not removed, which struck her as either careless or deliberate. "Miss Cleaver," he said, "my name is Donald Bell. I work for Mayor Grimmer. I would like to talk to you before that becomes a problem for both of us." She made him tea, because it was cold and because the act of making tea gave her something to do while she listened and watched his hands. A person's hands tell you things. Donald Bell's hands were steady. He sat at the kitchen table and spoke quietly and without preamble, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed what he wants to say many times and has finally decided to say it. "I have worked for Grimmer for 6 years," he said. "I came here from the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. I know cattle, I know land, I know the ridge lines. Grimmer hired me because he needed someone who understood the physical geography of what he was acquiring. He told me it was a legitimate land consolidation effort. By the time I understood what it actually was, I had been part of it long enough that I could not simply walk away without consequence." Judith poured his tea. "But you did not leave." "No. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because the Helt children were still here, and because I knew that as long as I was in Grimmer's circle, I could make certain that certain things moved slowly, that certain documents were misplaced for a week, that certain proceedings were delayed by administrative errors." Judith sat down across from him. "You have been buying time. I have been buying time. But time runs out. The land grant audit is in 3 weeks. Grimmer intends to use it to finalize every remaining claim he has been building, including the Helt homestead. Once those claims are registered at the territorial level, contesting them becomes significantly more expensive and complicated. That is when it stops being a town problem and starts being a bureaucratic one." Judith looked at him steadily. "What do you need from me?" He set down his cup. "I need you to prove the Helt land's eastern boundary encompasses the pass. If you can establish that, the land's assessed value exceeds any debt by a factor that makes the tax claim legally unsustainable, even under the 1880 statute. And I need a witness at the audit who is not afraid of Grimmer." "I am not afraid of Grimmer," she said. It was simple and true. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he said, "No, I can see that. I noticed that on the platform. There was a pause that held something she did not have a name for yet, a quality of warmth and attention that was not quite businesslike and was not quite personal and was somewhere in the precise, complicated space between." She filed it away for later. There was too much to do first. "The map in Robert Helt's tin box shows the eastern boundary," she said. "But I need it surveyed. I need it documented in a way that will hold at the territorial level." "I can survey it," Bell said. "I have the credentials. Grimmer does not know that. He hired me for cattle knowledge. He does not know I spent 2 years with the General Land Office before I moved to stock management." "Of course he does not," Judith said softly. "People always underestimate what they do not bother to ask about." Something shifted in his face, a recognition, and behind it, a very brief, almost rueful smile. "We should begin tomorrow," he said. "Before dawn, before anyone in town notices where I have gone." She nodded. "I will have Mary draw the route. She knows this land better than any survey map." He stood to leave. At the door, he paused without turning around, and she had the sense, from the quality of the pause, that he was deciding whether to say something else. "Miss Cleaver," he said finally, "thank you for stepping forward on that platform. I had been waiting a long time for someone willing to do that." She said nothing, but she held the door open until she heard his footsteps fade into the dark, and then she stood for a moment, with her hand still on the frame and the cold air coming in off the ridge, and she let herself feel, very briefly, that she had made the right choice getting on the westbound train. Then she closed the door, and went back to the ledger. The survey took 4 days. They went out before dawn each morning. Judith, Donald Bell, and Mary, who refused to be left behind, and proved so useful as a guide that neither adult suggested it again. Clara and Ruth stayed at the homestead with Dr. Hank, who had developed the habit of arriving each morning with a medical bag and a tin of biscuits, and the pleased, slightly sheepish expression of a man who has discovered that being brave feels considerably better than he had imagined. The ridge country was extraordinary. Judith had not expected that. She had been so concentrated on the legal and practical dimensions of the situation that she had not prepared herself for what it would feel like to walk through country like this. The high, thin air, the scale of the stone formations, the way the light moved across the valley below at sunrise and turned the dust and scrub into something very close to gold. "Your father chose well," she said to Mary on the second morning, standing at the edge of the ridge and looking down at the pass where it opened up below them. A broad, clean-floored valley corridor with a stream running through it that did not appear on any county map. Mary looked at it for a long moment. He said it was the best piece of ground in the territory, and that as long as we held it, we were never entirely helpless. He was always saying things like that. A pause. I did not understand what he meant until Grimmer started coming around. Bell was working 20 yards back, recording measurements with the methodical care of someone who knows exactly how much depends on precision. Judith watched him work. He moved through the landscape with a particular competence, efficient, quiet, thorough, and she noticed that he always positioned himself so that he had a clear view of both the survey area and the approaches, which was the habit of someone who had spent years in country, where attention was practical rather than anxious. On the third evening, walking back along the ridge track, their boots raising the dry dust of October, he fell into step beside her, at a distance that was closer than the one he had maintained for the first 2 days. "You were a legal secretary," he said, "in Philadelphia. For 9 years," she said. "What brought you west?" She considered the question. She could give the simple answer: the advertisement, the letter from Robert Helt, the calculation of a woman weighing what she had against what might be possible elsewhere. But that answer was accurate without being true. "I reached a point," she said carefully, "where the life I had was smaller than the person I had become inside it. I could not continue to fit." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said, in a way that did not invite further explanation, but communicated, clearly, that he meant it. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The ridge track wound around a juniper stand, and the lights of the valley below came into view, the homestead cabin's single window warm against the dark. "The survey will be complete tomorrow," he said. "The eastern boundary encompasses the full mouth of the pass. The land value at current cattle and timber rates exceeds any plausible debt by a significant margin." "Good." Another pause. Then, very quietly, "Judith." She looked at him. He was looking at the light in the cabin window, and there was something in his face that was careful and honest, and not at all what she had expected to find in a foreman's face on a ridge in Wyoming. "I want you to know," he said, "that when this is resolved, however it resolves, I intend to be here. If that is not unwelcome." She held his gaze for a moment. The high plains wind moved through the juniper. Mary had run ahead on the track and was already out of earshot. "It is not unwelcome," Judith said, and meant it. Grimmer was not a man who panicked. He was a man who escalated, which is a different thing and considerably more dangerous. When he noticed that his foreman had been absent for 4 consecutive days and that Miss Cleaver had also been absent from town, he did the methodical thing. He sent a man to the homestead to watch. When the man reported that Bell had been seen walking the ridgeline with surveying equipment and the woman from Philadelphia beside him, Grimmer sat in his office for a very long time, with his hands flat on his desk and his expression perfectly controlled. Then he told the man, "Tonight." Judith smelled the smoke before she heard Clara screaming. She came out of sleep in an instant, the particular, complete wakefulness of someone who has been sleeping alert, and was through the bedroom door and into the main room before the full reality had assembled itself. The south wall of the kitchen garden shed was on fire, and the wind, the same wind that had been building all day, was pushing it toward the cabin. Mary was already awake. Mary was already outside, and Judith could hear her voice cutting through the sound of the fire, not panicking, never panicking, this 12-year-old girl, calling out clearly for water and buckets, and directing her sisters with the exact, focused authority of someone who has been preparing herself to handle crisis since August. They could not have held it. 3 people and a water pump against a fire in a 30-mile-an-hour wind is not a fight anyone wins alone. But they were not alone. Donald Bell arrived first. He had been sleeping in the stable rather than returning to town, because something about the afternoon had told him tonight was the wrong night to be far away. He came at a full run with 2 water buckets and a saddle blanket, and threw himself at the fire with an efficiency that broke the initial momentum of it. Then came Miller. Judith did not know Miller yet. She would come to know him as a rancher of middle years who had been a member of the town council since its founding, and who had sat in that council for 4 years, watching Grimmer do what Grimmer did, and said nothing, because saying something and then being alone in saying it is a particular kind of courage that is very difficult to sustain. But Miller had seen the smoke from his property line, and he had brought his 2 ranch hands and a water wagon. Then other people came, people who had seen smoke and come with buckets, because that is what people do when community means something beyond a word on a charter. They saved the cabin. They lost the shed. It took 2 hours, and left everyone standing in the dark, looking at each other, with a particular expression of people who have just done something together that they did not plan to do. Miller was a compact, quiet man in his 50s, with the kind of face that stores its decisions inwardly. He stood looking at the ruined shed for a long moment, and then turned to Judith and said, without preamble, "This was Grimmer. It was not a question." "I believe so," Judith said. He nodded slowly. "I have been quiet a long time," he said. "I am not going to be quiet anymore." Donald Bell, who had been wrapping a burn on his forearm with the calm deliberateness of a man who has had worse, looked up at that. Something in his face eased, the particular expression of a person who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been told they do not have to carry it alone anymore. Mary Helt, standing at the edge of the firelight with her sisters on either side of her and ash in her braids, looked at Miller for a long moment. Then she said, 12 years old, with the voice of someone twice that. "Then come to the audit, and bring everyone you trust." There was a silence. Then Miller looked at the girl, and very slowly nodded. There was, in the 2 weeks between the fire and the audit, an interval that Judith would remember for the rest of her life, not for its drama, there had been enough of that, but for its quality of quiet. The town had begun to shift. Word of the fire had spread the way things spread in small communities, not through any formal announcement, but through the particular human process of people telling each other what they had seen, and the accumulated weight of that telling, producing a new general understanding of what Grimmer was and what he had been doing. Dr. Hank began speaking more openly. Not in declarations, he was not, by nature, a man of declarations, but in the way he talked to his patients, in the observations he allowed himself to make. Judith noticed that he walked differently. His shoulders had come back and his chin was up, and he looked, frankly, like someone who had spent a long time folded inward and was discovering what it felt like to stand upright. "You saved him too," Mary said one evening, watching the doctor walk away down the track after an afternoon visit. Judith looked at her. "He saved himself. He kept the ledger for years. That is not a frightened man. That is a patient one." "Maybe," Mary said. "But he needed someone to be patient for." Judith had no answer for that. Donald Bell came by the homestead most evenings, on the pretext of checking the fire repair work, which was the most transparent pretext either of them had the grace not to acknowledge. He was good with his hands. The shed went back up faster than Judith would have believed possible, and he had a habit of working in a productive, companionable silence that she found, to her own mild surprise, deeply comfortable. On a Thursday evening, 2 weeks to the day before the audit, He brought a dinner of roasted rabbit that he had cooked himself, and which was considerably better than anything Judith had managed with the homestead's cast iron. They sat at the kitchen table together after the girls had gone to sleep, with the oil lamp between them and the wind off the ridge doing its usual work on the cabin walls. After the audit, he said, "Whatever happens." "Yes?" He looked at the lamp rather than at her, which she recognized as the posture of someone being careful. "I would like to ask if you might consider, if it would not be presumptuous, whether there is a possibility that you might stay. Not for the homestead, not for the children, though I know you intend that anyway, but for the place, for what it could be." A pause, and for the company. He did look at her then. Judith held his gaze for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the juniper. The lamp sent warm light across the table between them. Somewhere in the main room, one of the younger girls murmured in her sleep. "I have already decided to stay," she said. "I decided on the train. I simply did not know all the reasons yet." The look that crossed his face then was not the grand look of stories. It was quieter than that, a steady, warm, unhurried thing. The look of a man who has been hoping for something longer than he admitted, and is now being told that the hoping was reasonable. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. She did not move her hand. They sat that way for a while, with the lamp between them and the wind outside, and it was, in its quiet and its completeness, more than enough. The annual land grant audit was held on the first Friday of November in the Copper Creek Town Hall, a wood-frame building large enough to seat 40, and on this particular Friday, crowded with a great deal more than 40. Miller had not been quiet. There were ranchers and homesteaders from 3 valleys who had driven or ridden in before dawn, some of whom Judith had never seen before, but who came with the particular purposeful stillness of people who have been told that today is the day and have decided it will be. Grimmer arrived at 9 in the morning with his 2 hired men and his attorney and the composed, padded confidence of a man who believes he controls the proceedings. He walked to the front of the hall and set his documents on the council table and looked out at the crowd with his practiced administrative serenity. Then he looked more carefully at the crowd. Something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the first genuine recalibration of the morning. He called the order to order. He began with the first property on his list, a widow's holding on the north side of the valley, and began to read the tax assessment. Judith stood up. "Mayor Grimmer," she said, in the carrying voice she had practiced for years in a Philadelphia law office, where being heard was a matter of professional survival. "Before you proceed, I would like to formally enter into evidence a survey document, a land deed, and a ledger, which together establish that the Helt homestead's eastern boundary encompasses the full mouth of the Sagebrush Pass, rendering its assessed value, under any recognized standard, in excess of the claimed tax obligation by a factor of no less than 12. She placed the documents on the table in front of the council members. 3 of the 5 council members immediately reached for them. Grimmer's composure did not crack. It simply went very still. "These documents have not been submitted for prior review." "They have now," said Donald Bell. He was standing in the aisle beside the 3rd row. He had removed his foreman's badge. She could see it in his hand, and he set it quietly on the empty seat beside him. It was a very deliberate gesture, and the room understood it immediately. Grimmer's attorney whispered urgently in his ear. Grimmer listened with the expression of a man receiving information he already knows, but does not wish to receive publicly. Then Miller stood up from the back of the room. "I want to speak," Miller said. Not loudly. He did not need to be loud. The room was very quiet. "I have sat on this council for 4 years, and I have watched these proceedings, and I have said nothing, and I am saying now that I have been wrong to be silent. I have watched 11 families lose their properties to a process that was designed to look legal, and was not. I have the dates and the names, and I am prepared to submit them to the territorial authority." He sat back down. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which a great deal of private calculation is occurring simultaneously. Then, a woman in the 4th row said, "My husband's property, in '82, and named a statute. Then a man in the 6th row said something similar. Then another, and another. Grimmer's attorney touched his arm again. Grimmer looked at the documents. He looked at the room. He looked at Donald Bell, who had sat down with the quiet finality of someone who has put down a weight and does not intend to pick it up again. And the composure, the practiced, padded, expensive composure, cracked. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced a speech or a confession. It simply went away, and what was left underneath it was a man at a table, looking at a room full of people who were no longer afraid of him, which is, for men like Grimmer, the worst thing. "This audit is," he began. "This audit," said the council member holding Dr. Hank's ledger, "is going to take considerably longer than scheduled." He was right about that. "Hello, and thank you so much for still being here. Hey, quick question. Did you feel that?" When Miller stood up and the room began to speak. That is what happens when one courageous act gives other people permission to be courageous too. It is one of the truest things in the world. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We genuinely want to know what you are feeling right now. Before we reach the finale, if this story has moved you, please subscribe, like, share it with one person who needs a story like this today, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you makes this possible. Thank you, truly. Now, let us go back to Copper Creek one last time. The Territorial Authority arrived in Copper Creek on a cold Monday morning in late November, summoned by a formal complaint, co-signed by Judith Cleaver, Donald Bell, Dr. Harold Hank, and 6 members of the Copper Creek farming community, with Miller's name at the top. The investigation took 11 days. Jonathan Grimmer was removed from the office of mayor on the 7th day and arrested on the 9th, when the Attorney General's office confirmed that the Ridgeline Clearing Company was registered to 3 men who were, on closer examination, Grimmer himself, his brother-in-law, and a territorial council member who had voted to ratify the 1880 statute in the first place. The statute itself was suspended pending legislative review. The 11 properties were a more complicated matter. Frontier land law did not have a clean mechanism for reversing completed sales, particularly when some of the land had already changed hands a second time through parties who had not known the origin of the titles. It would take 2 years, and the work of a territorial legal advocate to resolve fully. But the Helt homestead was different. The Helt homestead had never been formally transferred. The proceeding had been interrupted by a woman with a marriage certificate and a voice that carried across a town square. The deed remained in Robert Helt's name, and under the guardianship claim Judith had staked on the day of the auction, it passed to her, and to Mary, Clara, and Ruth. Dr. Hank testified at the formal hearing with the iron-bound ledger in his arms and a steadiness that had not been there 4 months earlier. The territorial advocate told Judith afterward that the ledger was the most meticulously documented evidence of systematic land fraud she had encountered in 12 years of territorial law. He kept it for years, Judith said, alone, not knowing if anyone would ever come. The advocate looked at her. That is the thing about doing the right thing. It often requires doing it without any guarantee that it will matter. Judith thought about that for a long time afterward. There was a dinner at the homestead on the last day of November when the first real snow of winter came down off the ridge and turned the sagebrush wall white. Dr. Hank brought pie. Miller brought a bottle he had been keeping for an occasion. Donald Bell brought himself, which had become, quietly and without ceremony, something that everyone at the table expected and was glad of. Clara had taken to sitting on his left at meals, and Ruth had developed the habit of asking him questions of a detailed and relentless quality that would have exhausted a less patient man. He answered each one with the same thoughtful seriousness, which Ruth found entirely satisfactory. Mary sat at Judith's right and ate quietly, and watched the room with the particular watchfulness that would never entirely leave her, but which had, Judith noticed, a different quality to it now. It was not the blank, braced watchfulness of the auction platform. It was something more like attention, the watchfulness of someone who has decided that the world around them is worth paying close attention to. After dinner, when the younger girls had gone to bed and Dr. Hank had departed with Miller into the first snow, Mary said, in a voice that was entirely casual and entirely deliberate, "I think Papa would have liked it to be this way." She said it to the room rather than to any one person, and then she stood and said good night and went to her pallet, which she had long since claimed as her own by the precise territorial logic of a 12-year-old who knows what she wants. Judith and Donald sat for a while in the quiet. "She is going to be extraordinary," he said. "She already is," Judith said. He looked at her. The lamp was between them as it had been on that Thursday evening, and the wind was doing its usual work on the walls, and the snow was coming down outside in the way that first snow always comes, softly, covering things over, making the world quiet and clean and new. "Judith," he said. "I know," she said. And she did. He reached across the table. She met him halfway. Outside, the snow kept falling on the sagebrush wall, on the pass that the Helt family had held and would go on holding, on the valley below, where a town was slowly, imperfectly, honestly learning to be a community again, on the graves of people who had tried, and on the lives of people who were still trying, and in the cabin, in the warmth of the lamp, and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of people who have chosen each other. The last of the evening burned quietly and peacefully down. Jonathan Grimmer was convicted on 4 counts of fraudulent land acquisition and 1 count of felony arson in the spring of 1885. He served 7 years in the territorial penitentiary and was never again permitted to hold public office. His brother-in-law accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for his full testimony. The Ridgeline Clearing Company was dissolved by court order. The 1880 Frontier Tax Delinquency Statute was repealed by the territorial legislature in March of 1885, following a formal review that cited, in its own language, the systematic abuse of its provisions. In its place, a revised statute was passed that required a minimum 45-day public posting period, a full council hearing with legal representation available to all parties, and a mandatory independent property assessment before any estate action could proceed. The law is not a perfect instrument, but it can be made better. That is the lesson, and it is a lesson worth holding. Dr. Harold Hank continued to practice medicine in Copper Creek for another 18 years. His ledger was cited in 3 subsequent territorial fraud cases. He was, by the end, a great deal more upright than he had been at the beginning, which is all any of us can reasonably hope for. Miller served as mayor of Copper Creek from 1886 to 1894, during which period the town built a school, a proper court of record, and a community grain storage that belonged collectively to the farming families of the valley. His idea, and a good one. Donald Bell was appointed the first certified land surveyor of Copper Creek County in 1885, a position he held while also managing the expanded Judith Cleaver homestead, which he had helped to build into something considerably more substantial than a dilapidated cabin and a burned shed. Judith Cleaver married Donald Bell on a Saturday in April of 1885 in the town square of Copper Creek, in front of more people than had gathered there since the day of the auction. Mary was her attendant. Clara scattered wildflowers. Ruth gave a speech that lasted 11 minutes and was, by all accounts, extremely thorough. Mary Helt grew up in the homestead and went to study law in Cheyenne at the age of 18. She returned to Copper Creek in 1893 and became the first woman admitted to the Wyoming Territorial Bar, which was, by that point, a state bar, Wyoming having been admitted to the Union in 1890 as the first state in American history to grant women the right to vote. Mary found this fitting. She was, by temperament, a person who found justice fitting when it arrived, and who worked toward it with steady, meticulous patience in the meantime. And Judith Cleaver Bell, stayed. She had come to outrun an empty life, and had found a full one instead, full of difficult work and necessary fights, and 3 girls who were not her daughters by blood, but were hers, in every way that has ever counted, and a man whose hands were steady, and whose word was good, and a valley in Wyoming that smelled of juniper and high plains wind, and, on the right kind of morning, something close to promise. She had stepped forward when it would have been easier not to. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. Thank you for journeying all the way through this story with us. If there is something you carry with you from Copper Creek today, the image of a woman raising her hand in a dusty town square, the patience of a doctor who kept a ledger no one asked him to keep, the quiet courage of a 12-year-old girl who held her sisters close and refused to break, then this story has done what good stories are meant to do. Here is what we want you to remember. Courage does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive on horseback or carry a badge. Sometimes it arrives with a weathered trunk and a legal certificate, and the knowledge, quiet and unshakable, that stepping forward is the only option that belongs to a person of conscience. And sometimes, one person stepping forward is all it takes to give an entire room permission to breathe. If this story moved you, truly moved you, please subscribe, share it with one person who needs it today, drop a like, and leave us a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every single comment, every subscriber, every share carries this story further than we can carry it alone. We are building a community of people who believe in stories that matter. Thank you for being part of it. Until next time, keep seeking the truth, protect those who need a voice, and never ever underestimate what one person willing to step forward can do. The end.